Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Ventures Podcast. One of the best things I think I have to offer, and guests that I might bring onto the show, is helping you learn product management and software development in both Web2 and Web3 paradigms. Now, I'm not going to recreate the wheel. There are tons of amazing resources on the internet, but what's often confusing as a student is what resources to consume in what order if your end goal is to learn how to build products and develop software in Web2 and Web3. So that's a very specific niche. Obviously, you can build lots of different types of products, lots of different types of digital products. You can build lots of different types of software products and develop lots of different ways, but I'm going to have a very opinionated way that I'm going to teach, and that's going to be in Web2 web development framework called Ruby on Rails. And we'll talk about the Ethereum virtual machine and ways of developing smart contracts in Web3 with Solidity, and then how the Solana ecosystem does smart contracts and how the Cosmos ecosystem does smart contracts, so things like that. But there's significant paradigm shifts. So what we'll cover here is we'll cover Web2 and Web3 paradigms when it's time to write code. We're going to cover a number of things. And by the way, if you're just listening to this podcast, if you look at the links in your show notes, I'll have the video, because I'm sharing my screen in this episode for you to be able to see a couple more things, and then we'll call this good. So when it's time to write code, right? When you're building a product and you're doing the UX research, and you identify that, okay, it's time to build. You've done sufficient amount of validation that it's worth your time to build. Then I'm really interested in teaching you and guiding you through the different tutorials so you can get the essentials of computer science. You can learn about operating systems. You can learn about command line interfaces through different terminals and shells into that operating system. Version control, using an integrated development environment or an IDE like Visual Studio Code, using Ruby and Ruby on Rails to develop a web application with best practices with linting and testing, understanding what you're doing with these web development frameworks to produce HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and then more meta-level libraries like Tailwind that can help with CSS in your program. And then, as I mentioned, move on to Web3 and Solidity. So basically what I'm trying to do here is I want to do a call to action. If you're listening to this or you're watching this and you're interested in participating on this, hit me up. Like, go to wclittle.com. You can email me at just will@wclittle.com, or DM me on LinkedIn or Twitter. Those are the two that I probably pay attention to on the socials more accurately. So I'm just going to end with this, a quick little lesson to begin. And I've been playing around with Figma. I'm not a huge designer, but I just took a couple minutes before I hit record on this podcast to just put together a little graphic here. And if you think about, if I'm going to start introducing you to the basics of computer science for what's going on here, we are, most of the people I work with use Mac OS, although if you use Windows or Linux or some other operating system, that's fine. I'm going to be teaching mainly from a Mac or a Unix perspective. But really, if you think about it, on top of an operating system, you have these different programs or languages. And often people who are learning to code get confused about the difference between like Java and Ruby. So I actually pulled up ChatGPT here, and I asked it, what's the difference between a compiled and an interpreted programming language? Because something like Java is a compiled language, something like Ruby is interpreted. And it accurately said here, of course, a compiled programming language is a language in which the source code is transformed into machine code that can be executed directly by a computer central processing unit. And but an interpreted programming language is where the source code is not compiled into machine code, but instead translated into machine code at runtime by an interpreter. So in other words, you can write Ruby code and you don't have to wait and compile it like you do with other programming languages. It's just interpreted and brought into machine code at runtime, so it runs. So ChatGPT is smart to say the few differences between compiled and interpreted languages. You have execution speed differences, you have portability differences, you have development time differences and different language features. So I won't read all this. Obviously, you can go to your own chat GPT and ask our AI overlord about the differences between the two. But what's important is I think I'm going to teach product management and software development in the Web2 and Web3 paradigms. We're going to use ChatGPT, along with Google, of course, as a way to assist with your learning, because like it or not, this is our new reality. So to basically set this up here, then on top of your operating system, you're going to have programs and languages like Ruby, or a database like Postgres, or a key value store like Redis, or a Ruby web application server like Puma. And on top of Ruby, we have what's Ruby on Rails. This is a web development framework that makes it relatively easy. Nothing's simple or super easy, but relatively easy to develop a web application in order to serve whatever you want to serve. So I made a little graphic here. It says if you put in domain.com in your web browser, basically what that's going to do is it's going to query a server, which is going to be Puma, usually if you're doing a Ruby on Rails. So somewhere on a computer, you're going to request from your Puma web server some HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, because that's the language that web browsers interpret. And so what Ruby on Rails does is it's what's called the model view controller paradigm, or it's a type of web development framework. And the way this essentially works, and I'll just go quick here, is your routes tell what controller is going to feed. Your controller can work with your model, right? I can if I wanted to adjust this here real time, I could say my model can pull from my database, and the database can then pull information back into the controller that's fed through the views, and then those views essentially spit out HTML, CSS, and JavaScript back to the web browser, and then the web browser creates the visuals when you're browsing the internet. So that's an example in a nutshell of the types of things we'll discuss in the coming year with this Ventures podcast. Please hit me up again, will@wclittle.com, or DM me on one of the socials where I'm just at WCLittle, or WCLittle on LinkedIn. You should be able to find me. And I'd love to have you follow along and give advice and feedback as I do this journey with guests in 2023. Thanks a lot. All right, a couple quick things before you go. Number one, I have a general newsletter where I write about technology and startups and health science and teaching people to code. And I write about a variety of different subjects that we talk about on this show. So if you go to wclittle.com, there you'll be able to subscribe, and you'll also be able to subscribe to particular topics. If you're just interested in one or a few of them, you'll be notified right when I publish new content in those areas. Number two, my partners and I at Proto Ventures have a portfolio company called Startup Rocket. If you go to startuprocket.com, there you'll be able to receive coaching guides and customize an operations framework for you and your team and your advisors to be on the same page in terms of what is the appropriate next step for you and your entrepreneurial journey. And finally, if you wouldn't mind leaving a review anywhere that you have listened to this podcast or watched this podcast, it would be super helpful to help those who might be interested in consuming this content as well. Thank you.